The dust never left their lungs, neither did the screams of those who fell behind. In the year of our Lord 1096, Pope Urban II stood before a council of bishops and princes in Clermont, France. His voice carried the weight of centuries, nearly 1,000 years of Christian suffering, of pilgrimage made perilous, of the holiest sites on earth held in the grip of infidels. What he proposed that day would reshape the world. He called for a crusade. The words that left his mouth would set in motion events that would tear the medieval world apart and create consequences that would echo through 1,000 years of history. The Council of Clermont was not a small affair. Bishops and nobles from across France gathered to hear what the Pope had to say. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. For months, rumors had circulated about an appeal from the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. The Seljuk Turks had defeated the Byzantine armies at Manzikert, threatening the last vestiges of the Christian Roman Empire in the East. Jerusalem and the holy sites of Christianity had been under Islamic rule for centuries, but what had changed was the nature of that rule. Turkish overlords were less tolerant of Christian pilgrimage than the more established Islamic dynasties had been. Christian pilgrims increasingly reported harassment, extortion, and violence on the roads to the Holy Land. When Pope Urban II stood to speak, he painted a picture of crisis and opportunity. He spoke of the desecration of holy places. He spoke of Christian martyrs killed by Muslim conquerors. He spoke of the sacred Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site on all Christendom, the very tomb where Christ had risen from death, held in the thrall of infidels. He spoke of pilgrims turning back in fear or arriving only after having been robbed, beaten, or worse. And then he made his revolutionary proposal, not simply to defend Christianity's remaining territories in the East, but to reclaim what had been lost, to organize a military expedition not to hold ground, but to conquer, to reclaim Jerusalem itself for Christian rule. The response was volcanic. Knights saw in this call to crusade what they had always sought, legitimate religious sanction for warfare and conquest. A crusade was not simply war, it was holy war, sanctioned by God himself through his vicar on earth, the Pope. Sins committed in holy work could be absolved. Warriors who died in crusade were martyrs, guaranteed salvation. And there was another incentive: land. The Pope promised that crusaders could keep lands they conquered. For younger sons with no inheritance, for ambitious nobles seeking to expand their power, for desperate men with nothing to lose, the crusade offered something precious: the chance to build a kingdom in the name of God. But the response was not limited to knights and nobles. Peasants heard the message too, often delivered by wandering preachers who elaborated and embellished the Pope's words. Peasants heard that God was calling them, that the Pope himself had declared a holy war, that Jerusalem, the city where Jesus had walked, could be reclaimed for Christian worship. What was the earthly life compared to eternal salvation? What was suffering on a journey compared to the glory of standing in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Monks and priests preached the message with apocalyptic fervor, suggesting that the end times were approaching, that God had called this crusade as a sign of the coming judgment. To refuse the call was to refuse God himself. To refuse was to turn away from salvation. The response of the common people was extraordinary. In villages and towns across France, Germany, and Italy, peasants began to organize. They sold their lands, often at ruinous prices, to raise money for the journey. They left families behind, uncertain if they would ever return. They began to gather in groups, small armies of the faithful, all heading toward Jerusalem. By 1096, tens of thousands of peasants were on the move, heading toward the Holy Land. This became known as the People's Crusade, and it would be the first disaster of the crusading movement. The first wave of the People's Crusade, perhaps 70,000 strong, was led by a charismatic French monk named Peter the Hermit. Peter was small in stature but immense in spiritual conviction. He rode a mule and preached constantly, telling his followers that God marched with them, that miracles would sustain them, that faith would make up for lack of supplies or military organization. His followers were not soldiers. They were pilgrims transformed into warriors. And the transformation was incomplete and unstable. They had weapons but no training. They had faith but no logistics. They had numbers but no discipline. As this massive army of peasants moved through Europe toward the Holy Land, disaster after disaster unfolded. In the Rhineland, the Crusaders encountered Jewish communities. Peter the Hermit and other preachers had taught that Jews were the killers of Christ, that they were infidels just as surely as Muslims. Why should Crusaders wait to reach Jerusalem to wage holy war against infidels? Why not strike at the enemies of Christ in their own homeland? The result was pogroms, organized massacres of Jewish communities. Thousands of Jews were killed in cities like Cologne, Mainz, and Speyer. Some chose martyrdom rather than forced conversion. Mothers killed their children rather than see them forced to accept Christian baptism. The massacres were conducted with a zealotry that horrified even some Christian observers, but they revealed a dark truth about the crusade. In the fervent belief that they served God, Crusaders could justify almost any atrocity. As the People's Crusade continued eastward, the reality of the journey began to destroy the movement. Food ran out. Villages that might have supplied the Crusaders were emptied by the sheer numbers passing through. Crusaders began to starve. They fought each other over scraps of bread. Wealthy merchants traveling with the army were robbed and killed by their fellow Crusaders. Women were assaulted. Children died by the thousands. Historians estimate that perhaps half of the People's Crusade died during the journey through Europe, from starvation, disease, violence, and simple exhaustion, before they ever reached the Islamic world. Those who survived the trek through Europe faced a new reality as they entered Byzantine territory. The Byzantine emperor had requested military aid against the Turks, but he had not expected 70,000 starving peasants. The Byzantines were alarmed by this massive, uncontrolled army moving through their territory. They worried that the Crusaders would turn on them, rob them, or worse. Conflicts erupted between the Crusaders and the local Byzantine population. Some Crusaders were killed in skirmishes, others were caught and executed as bandits. The Byzantine emperor, desperate to be rid of this destabilizing force, hurried the Crusaders across the Bosporus into Anatolia, Turkish territory, as quickly as possible. In Anatolia, the People's Crusade faced its final reckoning. This was the territory of the Seljuk Turks, skilled warriors who had been destroying Byzantine armies for decades. The Crusaders were exhausted, starving, and disorganized. The Turks were fresh, disciplined, and commanded the territory. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. At a place called Civitat, the Seljuk army surprised the Crusaders and slaughtered them almost without resistance. Of the 70,000 who had left Europe, only a few thousand, perhaps 3,000, survived. They scattered, most making their way back to Byzantine territory, a few eventually making it to the Levantine coast where they could meet up with the armies of the professional Crusaders who were following behind. The failure of the People's Crusade was catastrophic. Yet it was not the end of the crusading movement. It was merely the beginning. The professional Crusaders, the knights, nobles, and experienced warriors were organizing for their own expedition. These were men trained since childhood in the arts of war. They commanded resources. They understood logistics and supply lines. They had armor and weapons and years of military experience. If anyone could accomplish the Crusade's aims, it would be these professional warriors.
Yet even the professional Crusaders found the journey almost unbearable. The same roots that had destroyed the People's Crusade now threatened to destroy the armies of nobility. Godfrey of Bouillon, a Flemish duke, led one army. Count Raymond of Toulouse led another. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer, commanded a third. Separate armies marching at different times, each recruiting thousands of knights and soldiers. They traveled through the Balkans, where the Byzantines treated them with suspicion. They crossed Anatolia, where the Turkish armies harassed them constantly. They faced heat that seemed to have no mercy. thirst that drove men mad, and hunger that gnawed at their bellies every day. The journey took years. Battles were fought at Nicaea and Dorylaeum. Supplies had to be captured or negotiated for. Alliances with the Byzantine Empire had to be carefully managed. The Byzantines wanted the Crusaders to defeat the Turks, but were terrified that the Crusaders would become more dangerous than the Turks themselves. All the while, the Crusaders marched toward a destination they had never seen, driven only by faith and obsession. By 1098, nearly 2 years after leaving Europe, the main Crusader armies had reached the Levant, the Mediterranean coast of what is now Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. They had captured the city of Antioch after a brutal siege that lasted nearly a year. The siege itself was almost apocalyptic in its suffering. The Crusaders camped outside the walls without adequate supplies, faced starvation and disease. They discovered the remains of fellow Crusaders who had been killed and left to rot by the defenders. Cannibalism was rumored. Some contemporary accounts claim starving Crusaders ate the flesh of their fallen enemies and even their fallen comrades. The exact truth of these claims remains obscured by time and bias, but the desperation was real enough. The city finally fell through a combination of starvation and betrayal. A man named Farus, an engineer within the city walls, was either bribed or converted or simply tired of siege and slaughter. He opened a postern gate on the north wall. The Crusaders poured in like wolves through a fold, overwhelming the defenders in what followed. The Crusaders, driven by years of hunger and fury accumulated over the terrible journey, slaughtered the Muslim inhabitants with apocalyptic brutality. Blood ran in the streets. Heads were piled in pyramids. Entire families were put to the sword. The killing continued for days as Crusaders hunted through the city for survivors. But Antioch was not Jerusalem. Antioch was only a milestone on the long road to perdition. It was a pause, a moment to gather supplies and rest, before the final push toward the obsession that had driven them across the Mediterranean world. The Crusaders spent months in Antioch, reorganizing, resupplying, and dealing with the city's Muslim and Christian inhabitants. Leadership questions emerged. Who should rule Antioch? Should they continue to Jerusalem immediately, or secure their rear areas first? Should they negotiate with local Muslim emirs, or continue military conquest? These political and military questions consumed weeks of debate among the Crusader leadership. Meanwhile, summer faded into fall, and the Crusaders began the final march southward along the coastal road toward Jerusalem. Each day brought them closer to their obsession. Each night brought prayers of thanksgiving for miles covered and curses for miles remaining. The heat in late summer was still murderous, though not quite as devastating as it had been during the earlier months. Men now knew they were close. Jerusalem was only 100 miles away, perhaps less. Desperation transformed into determination. They had endured everything. They would not be stopped now. The final march took weeks, moving slowly down the coast through Palestinian territory. They captured the city of Caesarea. They took Jaffa, gaining access to the sea and potential supply lines from Christian allies in the Mediterranean. They pushed inland, heading toward the hills where Jerusalem lay, and then in early June 1099, after nearly 3 years of walking and fighting and starving and dying, after enduring the impossible, the Crusaders came around a ridge in the hills and saw it. Jerusalem. The city gleamed in the summer light like a promise made real. like everything they had sacrificed for crystallized into stone and geography. The walls rose up against the sky, massive, formidable, ancient, intimidating. They were 30 to 40 feet high, built with the accumulated engineering knowledge of centuries. The Dome of the Rock, that glittering shrine of Islam, dominated the skyline with its golden surface reflecting the sun. Behind those walls was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred site in all Christendom, the tomb where Jesus had been buried and from which he had risen. Behind those walls was God's work waiting to be reclaimed. The Crusaders fell to their knees and wept. Soldiers who had killed hundreds and seen friends die in agony wept like children. Priests raised their hands to heaven and sang hymns with voices cracked and broken by thirst. Nobles who commanded kingdoms fell prostrate in the dust. For nearly 3 years they had wondered if they would ever reach this place. Now it lay before them, separated only by walls and an army of defenders. Approximately 60,000 Crusaders faced a garrison estimated between 3,000 and 6,000 Muslim defenders. On paper, the odds seemed impossible, overwhelmingly in favor of the Crusaders. But the walls of Jerusalem had held against some of the greatest armies in history. They had endured Roman sieges that lasted months. They had endured Persian invasions. They had resisted Arab conquests. The fortifications were ancient, proven, and designed by military engineers who understood siege warfare. The Crusaders, by contrast, were starving and depleted, worn down to bone and sinew by the 3-year journey. They had lost half of their original force. They were exhausted and desperate. But what the Crusaders possessed that the defenders lacked was absolute conviction combined with absolute desperation. The Crusaders had nothing left to lose. They could not go home. They had no way to pay for the journey back. They had already sacrificed everything. Jerusalem was the only way to validate the suffering, the deaths, the hunger. For the defenders, meanwhile, the situation was different. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their faith, but they also knew they could not hold out forever. They had supplies for a time. No relief army was coming. The caliphate in Egypt was distant and preoccupied. Help would not arrive. In that moment, before the gates of Jerusalem in early June 1099, 2 worlds collided. The cross and the crescent stood opposed, separated by stone and determination and the fundamental question of who had the right to hold the holiest city on earth. The suffering of the Crusaders, 3 years of dying to reach this point, now crystallized into a single burning obsession. They would take this city or they would die trying. They had not come this far, endured this much, sacrificed this greatly, only to fail at the threshold. The siege was about to begin. The final chapter of the Crusaders' terrible journey was about to be written. And in the days and nights ahead, Jerusalem would run with blood.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Inside the walls, the defenders watched an impossible army materialize from the dust, skeletal and desperate, and absolutely committed to death or victory. The Crusaders who arrived at Jerusalem in June 1099 were not the gleaming knights of propaganda and legend. They were survivors. Their armor was dented and rust-stained from years of travel and combat. Their clothes hung in rags. Their faces were burned dark by the sun, their eyes hollowed by starvation.
Yet as they gazed upon the city they had sacrificed everything to reach, something transformed in them. The despair that had marked the journey metamorphosed into grim determination. They had come here to accomplish God's work, and no obstacle, not distance, not hunger, not even death itself, would stop them. The defenders of Jerusalem were equally committed, but far fewer in number. The city's Muslim garrison, led by the Fatimid governor Iftikhar el-Dawla, consisted of perhaps 3,000 to 6,000 warriors. They were well-trained, equipped with armor and weapons, commanding from walls that had defended Jerusalem for centuries. They had supplies stored in cisterns and warehouses. They had siege equipment in trained engineers who understood how to defend against assault. To any objective observer, the Fatimids had every advantage, except one. The Crusaders would not stop. They would not retreat. They could not go home. For them, Jerusalem was the destination, the purpose, the entire reason for their sacrifice. The Crusaders established their siege camp in a rough arc around the city's walls. They had no sophisticated siege equipment. Most had been lost or abandoned during the 3-year journey. No trebuchets, no siege towers, no supplies of timber and stone for building engines of war. They had only what they could create with their hands and such materials as they could gather from the barren landscape. The hills around Jerusalem were rocky, but mostly treeless. Every piece of wood would have to be scavenged, brought from miles away, carefully husbanded for the desperate work of building siege equipment. From the first days, the Crusaders faced their ancient nemesis, thirst. Jerusalem in summer is a place of appalling dryness. The nearby wells were poisoned by Muslim defenders, bodies thrown into them, blood spread across the water to render them undrinkable. Men who had survived 3 years of travel only to die of thirst now faced a bitter irony. Scouts fanned out across the countryside searching for water. The nearest source was the pool of Gihon, several miles from the city. Each day, parties of Crusaders had to make the dangerous journey to bring water back. Muslim cavalry would ambush these groups, killing water carriers in the rocky hills. It was a slow, agonizing way to wage war, not the dramatic clash of armies, but the grinding attrition of thirst and desperation. Starvation accompanied the thirst like a terrible twin. The Crusader army had no supply lines. There was no food in the surrounding countryside. The Muslim governors had destroyed the crops and driven off livestock before the Crusaders arrived. The Crusaders ate their horses. When the horses were gone, they turned to whatever they could find: leather straps boiled into broth, tree bark, insects. Stories circulated, some true, some embellished, of cannibalism among the desperate. One chronicle claims that starving Crusaders ate the flesh of Muslims killed in fighting. The exact truth of these claims remains obscured by time, but the desperation was real enough. Men who had endured everything on the 3-year journey faced the possibility of dying of hunger with Jerusalem visible from their camp. Yet in this desperation, the Crusaders displayed a resilience born of faith and obsession. Even as they starved, they worked to build the engines of war that would breach the walls. Wood became the most precious commodity. Crusaders traveled days to find tree stumps, dead branches, any timber that could be repurposed. They brought wood from Jaffa, the nearest port, in a relay that left men exhausted but determined. From this precious material they assembled siege towers, massive wooden structures on wheels that could be pushed against the walls by hundreds of men working in teams, guided by those who remembered engineering from European castles and fortifications. Slowly, impossibly, the siege towers took shape. The defenders watched and waited. They fired arrows from the walls, killing workers and soldiers. They set out sorties to attack the Crusader camps and burn the siege equipment. One devastating night, the defenders succeeded in setting fire to one of the half-completed siege towers, destroying weeks of work and killing some of the men who had labored on it. The setback was crushing, but the Crusaders simply began again, rebuilding with the same grim determination. By mid-July 1099, a month into the siege, the situation had become desperate for both sides. The Crusaders were dying of starvation and disease. Dysentery swept through the camps, the terrible scourge of medieval armies. Men died sitting down, their bowels loosened by dehydration and desperation. The death rate was appalling. Historical accounts suggest hundreds died each day from disease and starvation alone before any combat even began. Yet the Crusaders pressed forward. Inside the city, the situation was also grim. The population of Jerusalem before the siege was perhaps 20,000, a mix of Muslims, Jews, and the few remaining Christians who had lived there under Islamic rule. With the siege underway, the city became desperately crowded, as Iftikhar el-Dawla brought refugees and fighters inside the walls. Water became scarce inside as well. The cisterns held enough for the garrison and military population, but not for refugees. There were probably more people inside the walls than there was water to sustain. Starvation and thirst affected the besieged and besiegers equally. But the psychological difference was crucial. The Crusaders knew they were winning. Each day of siege brought them closer to victory. They simply had to outlast the defenders. Inside the walls, despair grew as defenders realized they were trapped. The hoped-for relief army had not come, and their supplies would eventually run out. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was distant and preoccupied with its own problems. No rescue force would ride to Jerusalem's aid. The turning point came in July when the Crusaders completed the first major siege tower and positioned it against the north wall. This tower, perhaps 30 to 40 feet tall, was built to match the height of Jerusalem's defenses. Covered with hides to protect it from flaming arrows, it was pushed on wooden wheels toward the wall by hundreds of men working in shifts, hundreds more standing ready to charge if a breach was made. The defenders responded with everything they had: arrows, stones, Greek fire, and incendiary liquid that the Fatimids used as a devastating weapon. The battle for the tower became ferocious and desperate. Men died in scores, crushed by stones or burned by fire. But slowly, relentlessly, the tower crept closer to the wall. When it finally touched, when the wooden bridge between tower and wall was lowered, Crusaders swarmed forward. The first men to cross that gap were heroes, or madmen, or both. They knew the arrows and stones would fall on them like rain, yet they charged anyway, driven by faith and the knowledge that they were at the threshold of the most sacred city on earth. Muslim defenders rushed to that section of wall to repel the assault. The fighting became hand-to-hand, brutal and desperate. For hours the battle raged across that narrow bridge, men falling to their deaths on both sides, bodies piling up, blood mixing with the dust and stone. By sheer weight of commitment and the relentless arrival of fresh Crusader warriors, the Crusaders began to prevail. More men kept coming through the tower, climbing onto the walls, forcing their way forward. The defenders, though fighting valiantly and with the courage of desperation, were being overwhelmed by numbers and the psychological knowledge that the end had come. A Crusader named Letard reached the top of the wall and planted the Christian cross there, a signal visible to everyone that the breach had been made, that the wall had been conquered, that the impossible was becoming reality. This was the moment everything changed. The Muslim defenders realized the end had come. The walls, which had stood for centuries against assault, which had resisted armies and empires, were being overrun. Orders passed through the city: retreat, defend the inner strongholds, prepare for urban combat. But many defenders had already decided their fate. Some chose death in combat over slavery or worse. Others simply abandoned the fight and fled into the maze of Jerusalem's ancient streets, seeking places to hide, or if not hide, to make their final stand.
The breakthrough accelerated. More Crusaders poured through the breached wall. The defenders could not hold a second line. They fell back toward the Temple Mount and the southern part of the city, where they established defensive positions around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But these positions could not hold indefinitely. The Crusaders, now certain of victory, advanced with increasing boldness. Crusader cavalry, finally able to operate in the open after months of siege, hunted down groups of fleeing defenders. The organized military defense of Jerusalem collapsed into scattered pockets of desperate resistance. By July 15th, 1099, as the sun set over the hills of Judea, the Crusaders had broken through the walls and poured into the city. The most sacred city in Christendom was now in their hands. The journey of 3 years, the suffering of hundreds of thousands, the deaths and sacrifices, all had come to this moment. Crusaders ran through the streets screaming prayers and songs, their voices echoing off the ancient stone. They wept and laughed simultaneously. They had done the impossible. They had conquered the unconquerable. God had granted them victory. But even as they celebrated, a darker chapter was about to begin. What happened next would define the crusade in blood and trauma for centuries to come. The streets of Jerusalem would run red, and the gates of heaven that the Crusaders had expected to open would instead disgorge something closer to hell.
The Crusaders did not come as pilgrims to pray. They came as conquerors to reclaim, and the threshold between those two states proved to be soaked in blood. When the Crusaders broke through the walls of Jerusalem on July 15, 1099, they did not find the sacred city awaiting their pious devotion. They found a fortress of desperate defenders, crowds of terrified civilians, and the accumulated tension of a month-long siege, where everyone on both sides knew that survival meant death for the opposition. What unfolded over the next days and weeks remains one of the most documented, yet most morally troubling moments of the entire crusading movement. The Crusader armies poured through the breaches in the walls like a flood, overwhelming all resistance. There was Godfrey of Bouillon's force from the north gate, Tancred's Normans from another section, and Count Raymond's troops from the south. They moved in coordinated assault, driving deeper into the city, compelling the Muslim garrison to retreat or surrender to captivity. The fighting spread through streets and alleyways as groups of defenders made stands at key choke points, gates, intersections, defensible buildings and courtyards. Each position cost lives on both sides. Bodies accumulated in pools and alleyways. The sound of combat echoed through the ancient streets, the clash of steel, the screams of the dying, prayers and war cries mixing together in a cacophony of violence. By the evening of July 15, the main organized Muslim resistance had been broken. The defenders were either dead, imprisoned, or in full flight toward the southern section of the city near the Temple Mount and the Great Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Crusaders had achieved their military objective. Jerusalem was theirs. They had conquered the holiest city in Christendom. God, it seemed to them, had rewarded their faith with complete victory. But this military victory now came with a question that would haunt the crusade forever. What to do with the conquered population? What happened next remains debated by historians, refined and analyzed by contemporary accounts from both Christian and Muslim sources, and magnified by legend and propaganda. But the general outlines are clear. In the hours and days following the breach, a massive killing occurred inside Jerusalem's walls. The first targets were the soldiers and fighters. This made military sense. Eliminating armed resistance removed the possibility of organized opposition or rebellion. The Muslim garrison was systematically hunted to the city's streets and buildings. When they resisted, they were killed in combat. When they tried to hide, they were discovered and executed. Some estimates suggest the entire garrison of 3,000 to 6,000 was killed. This was not unusual for medieval warfare. Defeated garrisons often faced execution rather than being taken prisoner, as feeding prisoners was impractical, and prisoners could potentially become threats if they escaped. But then the killing expanded beyond military targets to include the city's civilian population. Here, accounts from contemporary chroniclers diverge about scale and character, but multiple independent sources, both Crusader accounts and Muslim chronicles, confirmed that civilians were killed in large numbers during the days following the breach. The Crusaders, who had endured the impossible to reach this moment, had lost half their number to disease and death. They had gone hungry and thirsty for months. They had lived in constant fear of death in combat or ambush. They had sacrificed everything. Now they had won. They had conquered. The explosion of that accumulated tension released through violence against the enemy that had kept them starving outside the walls became essentially unstoppable. The psychological barrier that normally restrains soldiers in combat, the knowledge that killing should have limits, that non-combatants should be spared, broke down under the weight of accumulated trauma and conviction that they were serving God. Contemporary accounts describe Crusaders wading through streets where bodies piled up to waist height. One chronicle claims that Crusaders waded through blood in the courtyards of the Temple Mount that rose to their horses' bridles. While these accounts are certainly embellished by authors trying to emphasize the scale of violence and divine judgment, the logistics of such slaughter would be nearly impossible. They capture the general horror of what occurred. The killing was not a brief explosion of violence, but something that lasted not hours, but multiple days. Crusaders hunted through alleyways and buildings methodically and systematically, discovering groups of Muslims hiding in basements and towers and rooftops, and executing them. The most horrifying and well-documented accounts concern what happened when Muslim survivors took refuge inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, located on the Temple Mount. According to multiple contemporary accounts from both Crusader and Muslim sources, the Crusaders surrounded the mosque and killed everyone inside, soldiers and civilians together, in what amounted to a scene of calculated massacre. The exact number of those killed in and around the mosque is unknown and probably unknowable, but historical accounts describe Crusaders killing hundreds, perhaps thousands, in that single location during multiple days of siege and slaughter. One Crusader account, attempting to justify or contextualize the slaughter, later claimed there were military supplies and stockpiles of weapons inside the mosque that needed to be destroyed. But multiple accounts make clear the killing was systematic, comprehensive, and continued well beyond any reasonable military justification.
Crusaders defiled the mosque itself. Quranic texts were destroyed, prayer rugs were burned. The spiritual sanctity of the holy place was violated repeatedly as Crusaders hunted for hiding survivors and destroyed symbols of Islamic faith. For Muslims across the medieval world, hearing accounts of the desecration of their third holiest shrine, the news was met with horror and a burning sense of injustice that would motivate military response and holy war for generations to come. The Crusaders also turned on Jerusalem's Jewish population. Most of the remaining Jews in the city, a relatively small community by that time, perhaps several hundred to 1,000, were killed in the days following conquest. The exact numbers are uncertain, but contemporary accounts from multiple sources describe Crusaders herding Jews into the city's main synagogue and setting it afire, creating a horrific scene of mass suicide and murder. Jews who tried to escape the city were hunted through the streets. Some historians estimate that the few thousand Jewish residents of Jerusalem were almost entirely eliminated in the aftermath of the conquest, making the massacre one of the earliest and most comprehensive pogroms of the medieval period. Contemporaries in Europe and the Islamic world were troubled by the scale of the killing, even as they celebrated or condemned the victory. One Crusader chronicle notes, almost in passing, that the streets of Jerusalem ran with blood so profusely that Crusaders claimed the horses' hooves were stained red and the soil itself was soaked in blood. The author then adds a theological justification. This was the work of righteousness, the punishment of infidels in the name of God, the cleansing of holy ground from the pollution of Islamic occupation. But the dissonance in the text is obvious. The author felt compelled to explain and justify what had occurred.
suggesting that even Crusaders, despite their religious conviction, recognized that the scale of violence was extraordinary and required justification. Some Crusader leaders attempted to impose order and limit the killing in their sections of the city. Raymond of Toulouse reportedly sheltered Muslims in his camp and sought to impose ransom terms rather than massacre. He wanted to control the situation militarily and religiously to prevent the kind of wholesale slaughter that was occurring in other sections of the city under the command of Godfrey of Bouillon and Tancred. His efforts were partially successful in some areas, but he could not stop the violence entirely. The sheer momentum of conquest and religious fury, combined with the chaos of urban warfare in a medieval city, overwhelmed attempts at command and control. Once the killing began, once Crusaders tasted the intoxication of complete power over a defeated enemy, once they became convinced that God approved of their violence, restraint became nearly impossible to enforce. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, shaped by the biases and purposes of those who recorded them. Some contemporary Crusader accounts claim enormous numbers. One chronicle claims 70,000 dead. Another claims even higher numbers, designed to emphasize divine judgment. Muslim sources provide different figures, but also describe massive killing. Modern historians, attempting to work backward from population estimates and reasonable assumptions about medieval warfare and killing capacity, suggest the actual number was likely between 3,000 and 12,000. Still a catastrophic figure that represented a substantial portion of the city's population, but substantially lower than some contemporary claims. The truth is that no one counted. Bodies were buried in mass graves, thrown into valleys, left in the streets to decompose. The exact accounting will never be known with certainty. What is certain is that the killing was massive enough to horrify contemporaries, thorough enough to eliminate most of the Muslim civilian population in the city, and organized enough to suggest it reflected the will and tolerance of Crusader leadership rather than simple chaos or a riot. This was not a spontaneous explosion of violence, but a systematic clearing of the city through violence that took place over multiple days and in multiple locations simultaneously.
The victory that Crusaders had sacrificed everything to achieve lasted only a century before being reclaimed, and the cost of that single century would reshape the entire medieval world. In the hours and days following the conquest of Jerusalem, something profound occurred in the collective consciousness of European Christendom. Pilgrims wept before the tomb where Jesus had been buried and resurrected. Knights who had endured 3 years of horror now knelt in prayer within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For European Christians, isolated from the Islamic world by distance and profound cultural differences, the news of Jerusalem's recapture felt like a cosmic triumph. God had endorsed their crusade. Christ's city was back in Christian hands. The prophecies and visions that had sustained them seemed to be unfolding as ancient texts had promised. Messengers raced back to Europe with news of victory, and when the message arrived in the courts and churches of Christendom, the response was ecstatic joy. Bells rang in cathedrals, masses were celebrated. The Pope himself received the news with triumph. God, it seemed, had spoken through the Crusaders' victory. The practical situation on the ground in Jerusalem, however, was far more complicated and precarious than the triumphant account suggested. The Crusaders had conquered a city of perhaps 20,000 people in a region surrounded by Muslim kingdoms that vastly outnumbered them. The victorious Crusaders, who had numbered perhaps 60,000 when they arrived at Jerusalem's gates, were now decimated by 3 years of travel and warfare. Perhaps 30,000 remained alive after the siege and conquest, and many of these were sick, weakened, and uncertain about staying. These 30,000 exhausted and broken survivors were supposed to hold the city and surrounding territory against a Muslim world that had been shattered but not defeated, that was already beginning to organize a response to the Christian invasion. Many Crusaders immediately decided their pilgrimage was complete. They had walked to the holy sites, they had fought the fight, they had reclaimed Jerusalem for Christianity. Now they wanted to go home. Substantial portions of the Crusader army began the long march back to Europe, leaving behind only those who were committed to occupation and rule. Some stayed for religious reasons. They became monks and priests, settling into the role of guarding Christian holy sites and maintaining the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Others stayed for practical reasons. They had no money, no supplies, and no way to pay for the long journey back to Europe. A minority stayed for the real reason that motivated most conquest and settlement throughout history. They smelled opportunity. They saw a chance to build kingdoms, accumulate wealth, and establish themselves as nobility in a new land. A crusader named Godfrey of Bouillon accepted the title of Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, carefully declining the title of king, which seemed too proud before God and too likely to offend his peers. He established himself as the secular ruler of Jerusalem and the surrounding territories, taking up residence in the city and beginning the work of organizing governance. What emerged over the next century was the Crusader states, 4 kingdoms established by crusaders in the territory they had conquered. The kingdom of Jerusalem itself, controlling the holy city and surrounding lands, the county of Tripoli to the north, the principality of Antioch further north still, and the county of Edessa in the far north, each established by crusader lords who determined to maintain Christian rule over territory conquered by the cross. For nearly a century, this system held surprisingly well. The holy sites remained in Christian hands. Pilgrims could reach the tomb of Christ without first having to negotiate with Muslim rulers or pay the fees that Islamic authorities had previously charged. Trade routes were controlled by Christian powers. The military situation became surprisingly stable, not peaceful, but stabilized at a level where crusaders controlled territory and Muslim states largely left them alone, focused on conflicts with each other. But the stability rested on a fragile foundation that would eventually crumble. The Crusader kingdoms never developed stable government or secure economy. They relied on continuous migration from Europe, new crusaders arriving as pilgrims or settlers, fresh waves of warriors from the Western kingdoms. They fought constantly among themselves over territory and precedence, creating internal divisions that weakened them against external threats. They maintained a military edge through superior cavalry and the constant arrival of trained crusader warriors, but they were always outnumbered by the Muslim populations around them. Recruitment became increasingly difficult as Europeans began to understand that settling in the Holy Land meant harsh conditions, constant warfare, and probable death far from home. Over decades, the flow of crusaders slowed. The psychological distance made recruitment harder. New crusades were called, but fewer Europeans answered the call than had in the early years. Meanwhile, the Muslim world that had been fragmented and in disarray in 1099 began to recover and consolidate. Muslim leaders studied the Crusader military methods, developed countermeasures, and organized united fronts against Christian occupation. By the middle of the 12th century, a great Muslim commander named Saladin began to organize this unified response. He was Kurdish by ethnicity, charismatic in personality, and utterly committed to reclaiming Jerusalem for Islam. He united disparate Muslim factions, conquered Muslim territories to create a unified state, and then turned his attention to defeating the Crusaders. He defeated the Crusaders in multiple battles, most famously at the Horns of Hattin in 1187, where he destroyed a Crusader army in a decisive battle and then marched on Jerusalem itself. The reconquest was methodical and deliberate. Saladin laid siege to Jerusalem in 1187, precisely mirroring what the Crusaders had done nearly 80 years earlier. The defenders, realizing their position was hopeless and remembering what the Crusaders had done in 1099, negotiated surrender rather than face the massacre the Crusaders had committed so brutally.
Saladin, in a deliberate act of mercy and moral superiority, allowed the inhabitants to leave or remain under Islamic rule. It was, from a medieval perspective, an extraordinary act of clemency, and it underscored for contemporaries the difference between how the Crusaders had conquered and how Muslims reclaimed. This clemency also served Saladin's propaganda purposes. It demonstrated that Islam was the religion of mercy and Christianity the religion of violence. With Jerusalem lost again, what had been achieved by the First Crusade? Thousands upon thousands of Europeans had died in the effort to reach the city and hold it. Entire generations had been consumed by the crusading movement. Hundreds of thousands had been displaced or killed. For what? The question haunted crusaders and theologians alike. From a Christian perspective, the answer was complex and troubling. Yes, Jerusalem had been lost again. But for nearly a century, Christians had held the holy city. Millions of pilgrims had been able to visit sites they considered sacred without fear or excessive restriction. Trade had been established between Christian and Islamic territories. Cultural exchange had occurred at the margins. The crusade had, in some sense, succeeded, just not permanently. The eternal security of Jerusalem for Christianity that crusaders had hoped for was never achieved. The city would be fought over again and again, would change hands repeatedly, and would remain a source of conflict and holy war for centuries to come.
From a Muslim perspective, the conquest and reconquest of Jerusalem had created something tragic and transformative. Saladin's civilized reconquest, with its mercy and restraint, should have offered hope for coexistence and peaceful relations. But the memory of the 1099 massacre, the slaughter of civilians, the desecration of mosques, the systematic killing of non-combatants that had no military justification would define Muslim understanding of Crusaders for centuries. Even with Saladin's mercy, even with Christian pilgrims allowed to visit holy sites, the historical trauma of the 1099 conquest remained embedded in Islamic consciousness. The message seemed clear to Muslims. Christians could not be trusted to respect Islamic sanctity. Christian conquest meant massacre and desecration. Christian occupation meant violation of sacred places. This understanding would shape Islamic military response and holy war doctrine for centuries to come. The crusading movement itself was transformed by these events and the broader history of crusades that followed. Instead of a single focused crusade to recover Jerusalem, the Crusades became institutionalized as a permanent religious war between Christianity and Islam. New crusades were called throughout the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Some sought to recapture Jerusalem again, launching military expeditions that achieved minor victories but ultimately failed to hold the Holy City. Others fought in North Africa, in Spain, in Eastern Europe against pagan kingdoms, and even in the Mediterranean against piracy. The crusading ideal, launched from the heights of religious fervor in 1096, evolved into a permanent state of religious conflict that would define medieval history and cast shadows into the modern world. The human cost was incalculable. Millions died across 2 centuries of crusading, from combat, starvation, disease, and massacre. Families were separated as men left for crusade and never returned. Economies were disrupted by the constant demands for supplies and soldiers. Entire regions were depopulated by Crusader armies passing through and then repopulated by migration and displacement. The societies that remained in the Levantine Crusader kingdoms became deeply hybridized and fractured. Crusader rulers commanding Muslim peasants and subject populations, economic relationships built on coercion and conquest, cultural mixing that created something neither wholly Christian nor wholly Muslim, but something new and strange.
Perhaps most significantly, the memory of the First Crusade and the conquest of Jerusalem created a permanent rupture in relations between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Before 1099, coexistence had been possible. Uneasy, certainly, but functional. Muslims ruled over Christian populations in many territories. Christians served in Muslim armies as mercenaries and soldiers. Cultural exchange flourished in cities where Christians and Muslims lived together. Jewish communities were tolerated under Islamic law and maintained their own communities. After 1099, after the massacre and conquest, this model became impossible. The Crusade had announced in blood and steel that Christianity would expand by conquest if possible, and that Muslims needed to respond in kind with permanent military readiness, and eventually with their own expansion and conquest. The result was not the triumph of Christianity that Urban II had envisioned, but the beginning of nearly 200 years of organized holy war, a conflict that would define the medieval world and cast shadows into the early modern world.
In the summer of 1099, when the cross was planted atop the walls of Jerusalem, no one could have predicted that the victory would last less than a century, or that its echoes would sound through 9 centuries of history still to come. The Crusaders who stood in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping with joy and conviction that they had accomplished God's work, could not have imagined the future. They could not have known that their victory would create a permanent rupture between faiths, that it would establish templates for holy war that would echo through centuries, that it would transform the medieval world and shape the modern world in ways both visible and invisible. The Siege of Jerusalem stands as one of the great pivotal moments in world history, a turning point where the trajectory of 3 civilizations, European Christianity, Islamic civilization, and Judaism, was fundamentally altered. Yet the lesson of that moment is not simple triumph or tragedy alone. It is something more complex, the recognition that actions taken with the purest religious conviction can create consequences that contradict their own stated purpose. It is a demonstration of the dangers of certainty, the risks of absolutism, and the tragic gap between human intentions and historical consequences. Pope Urban II, calling for the First Crusade in 1096, sought to accomplish several objectives. He wanted to provide military aid to the Christian Byzantine Empire, threatened by Turkish expansion. He wanted to increase papal authority and prestige by organizing Christendom's military response to Islamic expansion. He wanted, most fundamentally, to reclaim Jerusalem and the holy sites for Christian worship and pilgrimage. These were not necessarily evil aims. They emerged from a genuine theological commitment and from the real difficulties that Christian pilgrims faced in reaching holy sites under Muslim rule. Yet the path chosen to accomplish these aims, holy war, conquest, massacre, created a cascade of consequences that the Pope and his contemporaries could not have fully anticipated. The crusade succeeded militarily. Jerusalem was conquered. Christian pilgrims could visit holy sites. For nearly a century, the symbolic victory was maintained. But the crusade also created a narrative of religious conflict, a template for holy war, and a memory of massacre that would poison relations between Christian and Islamic worlds for centuries to come. The immediate question raised by the siege and conquest is moral and religious. Did the Crusaders act justifiably in massacring Jerusalem's population? Medieval and modern observers have answered this question differently, shaped by their own religious, cultural, and moral frameworks. For Crusaders at the time, the answer was clearly yes. They believed they were executing divine justice, reclaiming land that belonged to God's chosen religion, and punishing infidels who had held sacred ground in thrall. This conviction emerges repeatedly in Crusader chronicles, always with the same underlying logic. God wills it, therefore it is just.
For Muslims, observing or remembering these events, the answer was equally clear but opposite. The massacre represented Christian treachery, a violation of the conventions that had previously governed Muslim-Christian coexistence, and a cosmic assault on Islam itself. From this perspective, the Crusade was not a legitimate religious war, but an invasion, an act of religious genocide. This understanding would shape Islamic response for centuries. Modern observers, equipped with different moral frameworks and historical distance, must grapple with the tension between historical understanding and moral judgment. We can acknowledge that medieval crusaders operated within a theological framework that made their actions intelligible to them. They genuinely believed God willed the conquest of Jerusalem. We can recognize that religious passion and certainty drove them to endure impossible suffering. We can honor the faith and commitment, the sacrifice and suffering. Yet we must also acknowledge that thousands of non-combatants were killed in a conquest justified by religious fervor. The massacre at Jerusalem cannot be erased or rationalized away. It remains what it was, a catastrophic killing of civilians justified by religious certainty. Perhaps the deeper lesson of the siege of Jerusalem is not whether the Crusaders were right or wrong, justified or unjustified, but rather what happens when religious passion becomes the primary motivation for political and military action. The Crusaders did not attack Jerusalem primarily for economic gain or territorial expansion. They attacked because they believed God commanded them to. They fought through impossible conditions because they believed their cause was sacred. They massacred because they believed the inhabitants of Jerusalem were the enemies of God. This template, religious certainty as justification for conquest and killing, echoes through history. It appears in the Reformation and the wars of religion that followed in 16th and 17th century Europe. It appears in the conquest of the Americas and the justifications for removing or converting indigenous peoples. It appears in modern conflicts where religious identity becomes the primary marker of enemyhood. The Crusade established a pattern in European Christian thought that faith itself could justify violence, that holy war was not an aberration but a legitimate expression of religious commitment. Yet there is another reading of the Crusade's legacy, one that emphasizes not warfare, but pilgrimage. For nearly a century after the conquest, millions of Christians could reach Jerusalem. They could walk where Jesus walked. They could pray at the sites of Christian faith. For many of them, the experience was transformative. Crusader and pilgrim accounts describe people finding spiritual renewal, moral transformation, and deeper faith through encountering the Holy Land. From this perspective, the Crusade was successful. It opened the Holy Land to Christian worship and pilgrimage. But this perspective requires ignoring the cost, the hundreds of thousands who died reaching Jerusalem, the massacre that established Christian rule, the century of religious conflict that followed. It requires prioritizing the spiritual experience of Christian pilgrims over the material reality of Muslim and Jewish populations killed or displaced. It requires, in short, a kind of selective vision that focuses on the Crusade's stated spiritual purpose while minimizing the violence required to accomplish it. The truth, perhaps, is that both perspectives are partially valid and partially incomplete. The Crusade was simultaneously a tragic human endeavor driven by genuine faith and a campaign of conquest and massacre. It accomplished spiritual objectives for some believers while creating trauma and suffering for others. It opened pilgrim routes while closing possibilities for coexistence. It expressed authentic religious commitment while exhibiting the dangers of certainty and zealotry. The most important legacy of the siege of Jerusalem may be precisely this recognition that even the purest religious conviction, even the most sincere faith, does not guarantee that our actions will produce good outcomes. The Crusaders who starved for 3 years to reach Jerusalem genuinely believed they were serving God.
Their conviction was real, their sacrifice was genuine, their faith was authentic. Yet the consequences of their victory included massacre, centuries of religious conflict, and the transformation of relations between Christianity and Islam in ways that created permanent antagonism. This does not mean that religious faith is inherently problematic or that crusades were uniquely evil, but it suggests the importance of humility in the face of certainty. It suggests that even when we are most convinced of our righteousness, we should pause to ask, what will our actions create? What consequences might follow from this certainty? How might those who oppose us understand what we are about to do? The Crusaders never asked these questions. They marched toward Jerusalem, convinced they were doing God's will. When they arrived, they acted on that certainty without restraint. In the long arc of history, the siege of Jerusalem represents a moment where the future divided. The conquest could have been followed by genuine coexistence, by attempts to build shared governance of holy sites, by mutual respect between faiths. Saladin's later conquest, accomplished with mercy and clemency, suggests that such coexistence was possible. But the massacre committed by Crusaders in 1099 made it harder. It created a memory that poisoned relations, a precedent that suggested Christian conquest meant death and destruction, and a narrative that made peaceful coexistence seem naive or impossible.
For Christians, the Crusade established that faith could move mountains or move armies across deserts to conquer cities. For Muslims, it established that Christian Europe could not be trusted with sacred Islamic territory, that Christian conquest meant massacre, that permanent military vigilance and response were necessary. Both lessons were wrong. They were overgeneralizations based on a single catastrophic event. Yet both lessons took root and shaped the next 1,000 years of history, creating a cycle of conflict and holy war that would define the medieval world and extend into the modern era. Today, nearly 1,000 years after the Crusade, Jerusalem remains contested and sacred to multiple faiths. Christians, Muslims, and Jews all claim spiritual and historical connection to the city. The question of who should govern it, how it should be governed, and what rights each community should have within it remains one of the central questions of Middle Eastern politics. The seeds of this conflict were planted in 1099, when the Crusaders conquered the city and established Christian rule through massacre. The aftermath has been centuries of conflict over a place that all three Abrahamic faiths hold sacred. Perhaps the ultimate lesson of the siege of Jerusalem is humility. Recognition that our certainties are limited, that our opponents' convictions are equally genuine, and that actions taken with the purest faith can create consequences we never intended. The Crusaders who wept before the Holy Sepulchre, the defenders who died protecting Jerusalem, the civilians who perished in the massacre, all of them were real people with genuine beliefs, real hopes, real loves, and real fears. The tragedy is not that one side was evil and the other good. The tragedy is that people driven by authentic faith and certainty created suffering on an apocalyptic scale. The walls of Jerusalem still stand, though different hands have held them in the centuries since the Crusade. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre still exists, though it has been rebuilt, destroyed, and rebuilt again. But the most permanent legacy of the siege of Jerusalem remains not in stone or architecture, but in memory. The knowledge that a great faith-driven endeavor produced both pilgrimage and massacre, both spiritual achievement and tragic violence, both victory and the seeds of endless conflict. In the end, the siege of Jerusalem in 1099 teaches us not that religious war is inevitable or holy war justified, but that the gap between our intentions and our consequences can be vast and tragic. It teaches us that when we believe most strongly that God is on our side, we should perhaps listen most carefully to those who say we are wrong. It teaches us that certainty itself, no matter how genuine, no matter how faith-based,
requires restraint and humility. The crusade reminds us that even our most noble causes can produce unintended consequences, that our conviction about right and wrong, even when based on authentic faith, requires constant questioning and restraint, and that the gap between what we intend and what we create remains vast, tragic, and historically consequential even 1,000 years later.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.